Hi, everybody. This is just a short lecture that's reviewing the visual analysis of data. So things you need to look for when you're evaluating the effects of your intervention using visual analysis. So as you're looking at your graphs and the individual data points and the trends and all of that, how do you make sense of that information? There is also information related to this on D2L. There's another video that was created by Dr. Wagner that talks through some of this information, and there's a document from What Works Clearinghouse that discusses visual analysis of data and goes into a lot more detail. I highly recommend that you look at that as you are creating your writing your results and discussion sections. So, visual analysis of data. We use visual analysis in single subject research for multiple purposes. One is to make formative decisions, so decisions as we're conducting our study and as we're looking at the effects of intervention, we're able to use those data and visual analysis of those data to make different decisions like is it time to move from baseline into intervention? Is it time to withdraw? Is it time to move the next student into intervention? Lots of different decisions that can be made. And also, when we're finished collecting all of our data, we have summative analysis as well. So overall, what was the impact of the intervention and was it effective for some or all of the students? We can look at changes within a condition, so within baseline or within an intervention, as well as across, so from baseline to intervention. Are we seeing change? We can use visual analysis to look at both. And when we're using visual analysis, there are multiple factors, and I'm going to go through each of those that you need to take into consideration when using this method to evaluate your data. And why won't my... There we go. Okay, so within phases, so if you're looking just at your baseline data or just your intervention data, there are a couple things that you need to consider. One is, do you have the number of data points that you have within a phase? As we've talked about before, the number, you need to ensure that your data are stable. So the number of data points that you need to ensure stability is going to vary just depending on the student's performance. You can demonstrate stable data in as little as 3 data points. Often you need more than that, but it is possible to demonstrate stable data at a minimum of 3 data points. And we're looking for stability, meaning predictability. So we can predict where the next data point would likely occur, because if the data are stable, then we know that this likely represents the student's typical performance of what naturally happens outside of the data collection that you're doing for your study. One thing you want to look for is a pattern. So stable data demonstrate a pattern, and we'll talk about what that looks like. But as I said, a pattern makes things predictable, right? You know what likely will come next, and that's what you're looking for. When we're assessing stability in data, you look at 2 different things. You're looking at variability and you're looking at trend. So let's take a look at those. Variability refers to how much fluctuation we see in a student's performance. So if we look at these 2 graphs here, let's say this is number of outbursts in a class period, okay? As you can see, for this particular student, you have a high level of variability. The data are up and down, less predictable, although we see that there is some level of predictability here. The student goes up and down, up and down, up and down. whereas a low level of variability, provides us even stronger predictability. For this student, we could likely figure out where their next data point is going to fall, and we know that their, in this case, outbursts will be in the same range, most likely. It's pretty predictable how many that they are going to have in a given day, whereas this student, it would be a little bit harder to predict. So variability is the fluctuation in the behavior that you're looking at, fluctuation in that student's performance. Higher variability isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it probably will take longer to establish a pattern for a student in that case when there's a high level of variability. The next thing you want to look at, particularly within phases, is the trend. And the trend is simply the direction that the data path is following. Okay, and we typically see one of two patterns, an ascending or descending trend. Increasing trend, decreasing trend. Sometimes you'll see a flat line, but not often. So when you're talking about the data, you can talk about the variability as well as the trend within that phase of the study. The next thing that we want to look at is the level of the behavior. And the level refers to how much or how little of the behavior is observed, right? So here we see a low level of behavior. Let's say we'll stick with the outbursts example. This student has a low level of outbursts. This student has a high level of outburst, right? So we don't talk about level as much within phases as we do across phases, but you can discuss whether there's low or high levels even within a particular phase. But then you're also going to want to look at that across phases and if there's change. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Right now. So between phases, you're going to look at those three things. You're going to look at level, you're going to look at trend, you're going to look at variability, but you're also going to look at how much change you saw in level and trend based on the implementation of the intervention. So do we see changes that are predictable? So if we expect the intervention to decrease the number of outbursts a student has, do we see that occur once the intervention is implemented? And so this can help us to understand the effectiveness of the intervention. So you're going to look for and discuss changes in level. So if this is number of correct responses in baseline, we see a low level of correct responses and very stable data. With the implementation of the intervention, we see an immediate change in level, right? We went from low to high. Immediate change in level, steady responding, and no variability in student performance. You're also going to look for changes in the trend. So do we see any differences in trend from baseline to intervention? So if we look at this baseline, we see that we have a decreasing trend in the behavior. So let's say it's correct responses. Students actually answering less problems correct with each subsequent session. We put intervention in place, the student begins to increase their correct responding. We've also seen a change in level from baseline to intervention. So we can look at this and predict that this is going to be a successful intervention. We're also looking at the lack, we want to see a lack of overlap in data points. And this speaks to level that we see for a student. So the less data that overlap between baseline and intervention, that demonstrates more of a change in the student's behavior as a function of the intervention. So if you see data that looks similar to this, as you can see, there's really not any change here related to level. There's no change related to variability, and there's really no change related to trend as well. So this would be considered a weak effect. I wouldn't be super confident that this intervention is having an impact for a student. Conversely, we can see in this example, we have a strong effect. So we see that there was low level of responding in baseline, relatively stable data with the implementation of intervention. We saw immediate change in level as well as an increasing trend in the students' data. So we can say, obviously we would need to reverse and do this again, but we could say, we could predict that this is going to be an effective intervention for this student. Okay, so I'm gonna now just, actually I'm gonna stop and have a part 2 because I'm running out of time, so. What happened? Where'd it go?